Hello, and welcome to the first presentation by one of this year's guest composers at the 2020 Virtual Composers Conference. My name is Kurt Rohde, and I am the Artistic Director of the conference. Today, we are honored to have composer Linda Catlin Smith talk about her work. Beginning a week ago, Linda and our other guest composer, Amadeus Regosera, have been meeting with our Fromm Fellows and Contemporary Performance Institute instrumentalists in daily seminars discussing an array of topics about, around, apart, and through musicking. I have been at all the sessions, and it's been a really rich and inspired series of interactions, and it's somewhat difficult to explain unless you're actually inside of it. So that's why we're having this presentation, so you can get a sense of what it's all about. Our format for today is simple. Linda will talk about her music and play some examples over the next 40 to 45 minutes. When she is finished presenting her work, our Fromm Foundation Composer Fellows and Contemporary Performance Institute instrumentalists will join Linda and myself on Zoom, and we will begin the question and answer portion of the presentation for the remainder of the program. If you would like to ask a question, please post it in the YouTube chat scroll and I will make sure we get to it. I simply ask that you try to make your question succinct and clear. Thank you. Linda Catlin Smith grew up in New York and lives in Toronto. She has had recent performances at the Tectonics Festival in Glasgow, 2 solo concerts at the Huddersfield Festival, and a new work for Exaudi Choir at the Principal Sound Festival in London. Linda has taught composition privately as well at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada, and has a long history of working with the Bozzini and Penderecki string quartets. Pianist Yves Agoyan, and the ensembles Array Music, Continuum and Contemporary Music. Recently, several solo discs of her music have been released on the Another Timbre label, and last September, her orchestral work, Nuages, commissioned by the BBC Proms, was premiered by the BBC Scottish Orchestra at Royal Albert Hall. I first heard a piece by Linda about 16, 17 years ago. It was a piano work, a solo piano work, and it was on a program played by someone I no longer remember, but I remember the piece. I was struck how the music was immobile and proceeding at the same time. The music occupied the time space as if it were activated, hovering about, and then turning in a direction I didn't even know was a direction. What strikes me about her music is the potency of profound restraint, like a wandering prophet who reaches a destination never considered along the way, but for whom no alternative destination seemed possible. It is music that is about nothing and means so much. And now, without further delay, Linda Catlin Smith.
Hello, Kurt. Thank you very much. I don't know if you can see me. I can't see myself. There we go. Hello, everyone. And thank you so much, Kurt, for that introduction. It's been such an honor to be part of the Composers Conference. I have had a wonderful time so far getting to know the composers and the performers, and look forward to hearing the rest of the works this week. It's been awesome. I'm going to present today some writing that I've been doing. I've been going back on and forth on this bit of writing about my process for a number of years, and this is the latest installment on my thinking. And it's called The Speculative Experience of Composing Music. And I'm just going to read it and discuss a little bit as I go and play some examples for you. My compositions are acoustic instrumental works, often slow and quiet in nature, sometimes described as introspective, and always based in explorations of color, harmony, melody, and texture, as well as something I might call mood or atmosphere. My pieces are intended to be subtle, focused more on the small change or transformation rather than the large dramatic statement. They do, however, have their own sense of an unfolding narrative and are not without drama, though it is a drama of maybe an interior, quiet kind. Speaking about speculative composition, what I'm calling the speculative experience, is somewhat difficult. To a certain extent, all composers engage in speculation in the course of their work. So it may seem like I'm talking about very obvious things, but I wanted to shine a light on the speculative aspect of composition to see if I can learn more about my practice. And I think it might be useful as a way to take you into my work. I'm what one might call a speculative composer, or one could say intuitive, but that's kind of a tarnished word these days. So speculative, that is to say, I don't plan everything in advance. I rather respond to the material at hand on a moment-by-moment basis during the course of the creation of the work. It's not improvisation, which is an art form I have great respect for. It's not just writing whatever comes into my head. It's not anything goes. It's not automatic writing, in other words. It's a mode of working that calls for scrutiny, questioning, experimentation, and a kind of ruthlessness in the process. I'm not using the term speculative composition in reference to a connection to the cosmos, music of the spheres, as some historic usage would put it. And it might be tempting to make a correlation to speculative fiction, a term coined by Robert Heinlein, otherwise known as science fiction. But I'm not really thinking of that here, though there are some aspects of that field that are intriguing to me. For instance, here are some definitions of speculative fiction that I found. Speculative fiction is a world that writers create where anything can happen. It's a place beyond reality, a place that could have been or might have been if only the rules of the universe were altered just a bit. That's from David Boland. What is speculative fiction? The classic answer is that it's the fiction of what if. What if we had a time machine? What if we had faster than light travel? And that's from Raymond M. Coulomb. I find these definitions useful, and they relate a bit to the idea of dream form, the idea that anything can happen at any moment. I especially like the what if idea. What if there's a trumpet? What if there's a bass drum or a harmonica? The mind makes leaps. So these ideas from speculative fiction are useful, but they're definitely not the whole story. The word speculation comes from the word speculum, the Latin word for mirror, from the idea of using a mirror to shed light into the dark corners. So the word is rooted in making one's way towards the unknown. The poet Alejandra Pizarnik wrote, "What is this job of writing? To steer by mirror light in darkness." Dictionary definitions of speculation include contemplation, meditation, or consideration of some subject, conjecture, to meditate or ponder a subject, to review something idly or casually and often inconclusively, to be curious or doubtful about, to wonder, to reflect upon, and there's that mirror image again. These definitions give a general description of being in an attitude of questioning or wondering. These are all based in being in a state of not knowing, of considering something that is not yet concrete or defined. I've always been drawn to slower music, slow movements of the symphonic repertoire, the light texture of Baroque music, the weaving of voices in the ars subtilior music of late 14th century France, the transparency of Webern, the pacing of Japanese court music called gagaku. I love subtlety and detail. I love music with layers, as in painting, with multiplicity, with atmosphere or mood, with intimacy, with long thoughts. I love slow music. I like to feel that I'm expanding time, that I'm making it larger than it is. I want to climb inside the petals of the rose. So I think I'll play a short excerpt of a piece to give you a sense of what the world of my music sounds like before I go on any longer. This is the first 2 minutes of an orchestra piece called Adagietto. So that's just the opening of that piece. And just to give you what I was going for there a little bit, I think I was sort of thinking of it as a small sea of harmony, really. That's a general description of what I was thinking about. But back to the process. So what is this process that I'm calling the speculative process? What do I have when I start to work? Usually I have the instrumentation and the duration. These are often given. That's it. As I said, I begin with no preconceived plan, no pitch process or system, not even a preconceived form. I begin with a blank page. Some people describe the blank page as being very difficult. I actually love the blank page. I think of it as a clearing. So while it can be a place of anxiety for many of us, it's also a place of possibility. But usually I have something else when I begin, a kind of image, what I call a sound image, that is something I'm drawn to or fascinated by. This sound image is usually brought about from thinking about the instruments. Someone requests a piece for a given set of instruments, and shortly thereafter, some image comes to me, a hazy, faint, foggy notion of an idea. So I'm going to play another excerpt now, which is of a string quartet. This is the Bozzini Quartet playing, and it's a quartet called Gondola. And the image that I was going for here, the faint, hazy, foggy notion of an idea that I started with, was the idea of instruments playing together and then being slightly not together. So the unison and the not quite unison playing, like a smearing of melody, actually. So here's the beginning of Gondola. So in the case of this string quartet, it was the sound of unison or not quite unison strings that kind of moved me in my imagination. And also a floating sense of rhythm, something not really in a groove, not caged by pulse. So with Gondola, the image was the unison, the not quite unison, like a hand trailing in water, like a drifting boat. This image then was the starting point. And so then you have a starting point, and then I have to come up with material that gets me close to the image in my head. And now I'm in the area of speculation. I'm imagining a sound and imagining what kind of life it might have. And this kind of speculative engagement, this thinking, is where my real work lies. Here, I'm in an attitude of thought that is open to associations, insights, leaps, where previous assumptions might get thrown into disarray. Can a piece start out with instruments in not quite unison? There's a kind of push and pull of images or sounds in a flow of thought towards something I only dimly perceive or imagine. And then at some point, there's a switch. Now I'm paying attention to this bit of material, possibly just a few notes. I'm no longer focused on the faint sound image in my head from before. I'm focused on the actual material that has come out of it. But even here, I have to stay open. I want to allow things to arise, and I'm hesitant to quickly dismiss anything just because it's unusual or because it doesn't seem to make sense. I can't rush to pin things down. I keep my options open, staying in a state of play for some time. The process is slow. Composing is slow work. Orhan Pamuk, in his book, My Father's Suitcase, says that writing is to dig a well with a needle. I find this to be a perfect image of the laboriousness involved in the speculative process. Writing music, perhaps like writing literature, is slow. I've come to the work sideways. I have to come upon it, like creeping up on it, like letting the work materialize. I love that word, materialize. Like watching a photograph developing slowly over many days or months. Photography before iPhones, one would take the negative of the film from the camera and expose it onto special paper, and then dip that in a solution in a dark room, and then another solution, and then hang it up, and then gradually this image presents itself on the paper. And that's a bit how the work develops for me. The author Nicole Krauss talks about building it from the inside. She says, I form the doorknob. Here's the doorknob. Now I need the door. This reminds me of a program note I wrote for one of my very earliest pieces called Little Venice. I enter through the window and discover the building. That was me understanding that my process was one of exploration and discovery. So wherever you start is the doorknob, and then you open it into the work. For me, the composition is not a pre-designed thing. I don't know the form. I don't decide I'll make a piece in 4 movements, or it'll be slow, fast, or anything else. Instead, it's like finding the smallest of threads and just pulling on it, pulling myself along this labyrinth warily, carefully, so as not to miss any possible stray thoughts or surprises or avenues. I have to be careful not to decide too soon what it is. My piece Nocturnes and Chorales, I kept the notation of that open for the longest time, just dots, no rhythms, nothing else on the page. I needed to not fix it too early, these dots, but I let it keep shifting in my mind until I understood its nature. The process requires massive working and reworking, going over and over the work to make sure. Nicole Krauss talks about work as excavation. A paleontologist goes over the same plot of land over and over to discover all they can, she said. This is how I feel about working with material. I go over it and over it to see what it's capable of, to see where I can push its edges. And this going over and over is partly an answer to the inner questions. Is it right? Is it long enough? Is it floating? Is it hovering? Is it anything? I want it to have its own rightness, but I want to stay open to possibilities. This leads me to my first paradox. Paradox number 1, it must be so, it could be otherwise. What I find important in this process is the chance to get to new understandings, to new material, new kinds of musical experiences, new for myself. I went back in the quartet to the initial material later on in the work to readdress that not quite unison. Here, I let it go on in a more continuous, long-winded way, with occasional moments of absolute unison, like coming into focus very briefly. In the composing, I was in a state of wondering, what would it be like if I let it go longer? So I let it go longer to find out. This mode of working, this mode of thought, is not about a kind of logical progression. A does not always lead to B. It's more a labyrinth of thought than a ladder of progression. It's not a pre-designed form waiting to be filled. As Edgar Varese has put it, form is the result of a process. And that's how I feel about my work. The work's evolution brings about its form. I discover the form. The labyrinth is a useful, if somewhat uncomfortable image. We don't know where we are in a labyrinth. There are all kinds of cul-de-sacs and indirect routes. So I have to be okay about being a bit lost. And this is difficult. It has to do with the serious discomfort of working in the unknown. I often feel that I'm working with a blindfold. And over the course of the work, eventually the blindfold is removed, only to realize there's another blindfold underneath, which is of course the next piece. Being willing to be in the uncomfortable, lost state is important to me. Architect Jean Nouvel says, I try always not to have the solution early. I try to decide the shape at the last moment. I just think that's somewhat astonishing for an architect to say. So I'm keeping things open, keeping it all at play, particularly in regards to form. This leads me to paradox number 2. I want to know. I want to stay in the state of not knowing. Back to the process. First, there was this faint sound image, then I come up with some material and my focus shifts to that. And then there's another facet to this process, and that is reflection upon the work thus far. I've been working in a state of heightened awareness and concentration and focus. Then I break that and I reflect upon the work done, like stepping back from the painting. For this, a clear-eyed ruthlessness is brought to bear, a certain detachment, what I think of as the critical ear. After all, you can write down anything and call it a piece, and many people do. And that's a problem. So for me, there has to be a rigorous questioning that goes on in periods of reflection. But I have to then accept the fact that there is nothing, really nothing, that can prove the work is good. Nothing that proves the work works. No 12-tone rows, no mathematical system, no overtone series analysis, no proof, nothing. And that's difficult, and no one can tell you. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying there's anything wrong with working with systems or 12-tone rows or anything else. They're marvelous. I just can't work that way. I wish I could. This idea of no proof goes along with something else I think about, which is that a work doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be provable in the logical proof-based sense. After all, sometimes the more measurable drives out the most important. That's from René Dubos, who's a microbiologist. A piece has to make sense according to the piece's own contexts, its own truths. It has to have its own sense of rightness, perhaps in terms of balance or proportion or all its sound qualities. As I often say, we are not, after all, building a house where the walls could fall down and kill someone. We're not solving those kinds of problems. One of my favorite pieces is Webern's Symphony Opus 21. Many people regard this work highly because of its strict adherence to the 12-tone system, its analyzable structure. But I find it to be sheerly beautiful, beautiful for its sound, along with the beauty of its structure. Art is not a crossword puzzle. It doesn't have to work out. Composing is not so much about problem solving, something we often hear about, as it is about problem creating, as the painter Chuck Close has put it. The problem creation of writing a piano trio, for instance, is balance. What do you do with that piano? Writing a piece for gamelan and string quartet, the problem creation there is tuning. I'm going to play one more excerpt, and this is from a recent piano solo called White Lace that I wrote for Satoko Inoue. The image comes from thinking about the higher part of the piano, chords that in that highest register are kind of drained of their color and resonance. The chords are thick, but with a bit of transparency. So that's where the title, White Lace, comes in. Here's just a few minutes of that. That work will be played in its entirety shortly by Peggy on an upcoming concert. Okay, back to the process. The speculative process is an encounter with the unknown and with the what might be. I'm always looking for something, but I don't necessarily know what I'm looking for until I find it. I want to hone my ability to grasp the surprising new thing, the unlikely thing that suggests itself. I want to hone my understanding of the possible. Picasso said, you have to have an idea of what you're going to do, but it should be a vague idea. And a painting is not thought out and fixed beforehand. While one is painting, it follows the mobility of one's thought. Sometimes you write or compose not to get the answer, but to get the question. What am I really dealing with? What is this piece about? Paradox number 3. The more I don't know what I'm doing, the more I feel I'm going in the right direction. I'm working with a kind of deliberate disorientation. What is very important is to keep this disorientation alive so that I'm not too comfortable, too safe. I want to get myself out of my comfort zone. It's a balancing act between what I can control and what I don't yet understand, between the known and the mysterious. I don't seek a point of closure or culmination, but one of opening and departure. There's a flux of experience, an ambiguity of meaning. And let's face it, meaning in music is already pretty elusive. I want to get to the point where everything is new. It's like that story I love to tell about this brand new puppy, and the owner is trying to get it to move, and it's just not moving because it's smelling every leaf and every breath of air and noticing every little thing. Everything is new. It cannot move. It's so entranced with life. I do all this with doubt as a partner at my side. Is it there? Is it anything? Doubt is incredibly important because it can keep one away from cliches or easy solutions. Therefore, I invite doubt to be there, but without letting it paralyze me. It's a very important part of the process. Doubt keeps me honest and allows me not to settle too quickly. It keeps me from blind acceptance. It keeps me on my toes. The process then of working the material and wondering and reflecting requires intense concentration, intense focus, and a patient waiting, a waiting and a listening. For me, there's a fascination with subtleties, with detail, with small things. I tend to work very closely, like getting right up to the canvas, playing a chord over and over again to understand it, to make sure it's right. I respond to initial material by experimenting, seeing what I can do or what it can do, stretching it out, thinning it, making it higher or lower, repeating, varying, the what if aspect of the process. And this is very useful for composers who suffer from blocks, as some of my students have. The what if. What if this goes longer? What if I do it backwards? What if I leave out something? What if I add something? Does it need to thin out here? What if it slows down? What if I have a silence? And then there are other questions. What are the work's qualities? Is it smooth, rough, delicate, harsh, calm, lively? What is its nature? What is this world? I think we, or I should say I, also have to be willing to go against the grain of accepted practice. The painter Willem de Kooning said, "Art should not have to be a certain way." Art should not have to be a certain way. I really love that. It's my declaration of independence. Pieces should be ABA? Who says so? A work must have a climax? According to whom? Phrases should be so long, the soloist must have virtuoso passages. Why? I'm always free to ask, could it be otherwise? So the best thing a composer could write over her desk are two questions. What if, and why not? What we composers bring to this speculative process is our history and aesthetic, our imagination, and our technical capability. What is compositional technique? Foremost, it's our ear and our imagination. How do we build technique? Listening to repertoire, can't do it enough. Live concerts, can't do it enough. Studying scores, can't do it enough. We must have a vast and detailed understanding of instruments, not just things like their ranges and how they work, but all of their sonic aspects. We must have a fascination with and detailed understanding of notation. We must be interested and eager to know repertoire of the past and present, to be open to all styles, to all possibilities. We have to be fluent with things like variation, repetition, contrast, juxtaposition. We have to understand acoustics, the time sound takes to get from the instrument to our ears. We have to have a feeling for texture, for layering, for complexity and simplicity. We have to have a feeling for our own sense of aesthetics. And these are ongoing aspects that we work on our entire lives. I think of my work as being steeped in a kind of introspective atmosphere or mood, but I'm not at all interested in self-expression. Paradox 4. How to compose with one's own voice, but not be involved in self-expression. My work is not autobiographical. If I thought it was about me, I'd probably slit my wrists. I used to think my work was non-narrative, but we're always involved with narrative. How can we not be? There's always beginning, middle, end. I'm more interested, though, in creating a world rather than a story, a place to inhabit, even for a brief time. I'm interested in the slow and subtle unfolding rather than the epic or grand statement. I'm interested in compositions that are more a state of being than a tale. One of the most useful aspects of this kind of work is variation. Variation is a constant investigation of material. Epic work is the opposite. Epic work goes outward, ever venturing into new areas and new territories and new adventures toward grand events and big emotions. The hero leaves on a journey, kills the dragon, saves the princess, finds the treasure. That's epic. Variation, on the other hand, goes deeper and deeper into the same material, finding new things by going around and around, like journeying down a spiral, or like strange attractors, never traversing the same path twice. Rather than exploring a range of emotions, circling instead within a state of being, a kind of saturation. Writing comes from reading, painting comes from seeing, composing comes from listening, especially to the work of other artists. All composers come out of tradition of some kind. All composers, alive and dead, are connected in a constellation of compositional thought. All of our work is connected in a web of music, one strand linking to Bach, another to the Beatles, another to Anton Webern, another to John Cage, and so on. I'm always in conversation with Stravinsky and Feldman and Debussy. I'm in conversation with painters Giorgio Morandi, Agnes Martin, and Mark Rothko, with writers Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner. Their work is something I think about and ponder, and I'm open to their influences. The speculative process of composition takes time to ask questions, to try possibilities, to ponder, to wonder. It takes time because we are undergoing always an evolution of our understanding. There are thoughts to be thought and music to be written that none of us has even imagined. And what about speculative listening? How do we experience music? We all hear differently. We share the hearing of a work, but we experience it differently. We each hear in our own way. I think listening is also an art. How can we be attuned to a piece of music? How can we connect to its affect, its atmosphere, its dramas, its sonorities? For instance, some people are unable to hear Feldman's long pieces, and others Wagner. Some people are unable to see Agnes Martin's paintings or Mark Rothko's beautiful abstractions. We have to develop our attention span for music. We have to cultivate our ability to focus. Does the work draw us in, or are we left out of it somehow? So we have speculative listening. If you are a speculative listener, you're in a state of wonder, and that wondering will bear fruit. The poet Elizabeth Bishop puts it this way: what we experience in art is what is required to make it. Self-forgetful, useless concentration. So, useless in that there is no right thing to get here. Self-forgetful means we are giving ourselves up to the experience of wondering and listening. And that kind of concentration allows us to get what riches come from the work. I want to create works that are intimate, subtle, unusual. I want to slow time down and draw the listener close. I titled one of my orchestra pieces Wilderness. That's the idea of wilderness, the stepping out into the unknown. Every blank page is a wilderness. Every work is a venture into that wilderness. Every new work is a speculative glance into the shadowy, unlit corners of what music might be. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Linda. That was wonderful. I really appreciate your taking the time to put together such a really cohesive and rich and deep sort of snapshot or sort of slice of what is all about for you. I just wanted to start us off with the question and answer portion. I see that there are a number of questions being put up on YouTube, so I encourage people to continue to do that. And then I will open it up to the folks who are here with us on Zoom. But I just wanted to begin and discuss something with you just to get us started. So you mentioned in one of our forum meetings that your titles are evocative of something with actually specifically saying what it is, that the titles are very close to being something we recognize, but are somehow changed so that they are not what, that they are actually something that is not real or something that we don't recognize. So I think of the string quartet Folkstone, which almost is like folk song. Then there are the titles that are almost blank. They're almost like, it made me think as I was thinking about this question, you're mentioning the blank page that you start with, and it's sort of, you're being drawn and attached to in a very positive way to the blank page. So they are almost blank or almost anonymous. So I think it's something like meadow or wilderness, bloom, dark flower, forest. I mean, these are words we use in everyday language, and yet they are the titles of these pieces that are anything but everyday music. And I think that it's almost as if your titles, and by extension your music, sort of orbit around the planet of your music, where there's the core and then there's the surface of the work. And the music itself is so clear and purposeful and full of intention, even though you're talking a lot about this process that is paradoxical and also is generated by speculation. And I think it's sort of like almost a contradiction, but it's never quite a contradiction. It somehow all works out. It's deeply interesting to me. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little more about how you understand your place in your creativity. You discussed at the beginning this process of your process is the indispensability of speculation as being central to what you do. You talk about paradox and its value in terms of keeping the unknown always in play. And I guess I want to know how you've come to maintain that sense of clarity and vulnerability and center in your creativity so consistently, but the things you're talking about are pushing up against, they are anything but clear. And they are anything but, they invite, you either can be vulnerable to them and let it happen, or you can sort of be defeated. I don't know how you do that. If you could just talk about the relationship, your actual relationship to those things a little bit more.
Well, that was quite a lot of things you talked about just there. It's great. Let me just first say about titles. They're kind of, you have to call your piece something. And I choose images or things that were in my head somewhere along the way. And they're like, they usually come at the end. I don't sit with them during, it's like a slight realization of some way to think about what I've just done. So that's kind of how I think of that. Thinking about, in a way, what you're addressing is this kind of tightrope that one is on all the time in terms of how you understand what you're doing. And, I think it's very common, and especially for myself, I think that I think I'm doing one thing and the piece is actually maybe doing something else. And it's so hard to always be aware of everything that's coming up in the working process. But that's why I like the attitude of constant questioning and the wondering and being willing to be in that uncomfortable state of just, gee, I don't really understand, or I don't know what to do, or I'm not sure this is really worth, that anybody's going to hear this, and it also goes to the fact of, not too long ago, I had this problem where there was a sound that I could hear. It was a drone. It was a machine, very low level sound, and I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. It started one week and it just didn't go away, and nobody else could hear it but me. But I finally hired, at kind of a serious amount of money expense, an acoustic expert who came with this $50,000 microphone. He couldn't hear the sound either. And I said, it's a pitch between C and C sharp in this octave. I was very precise. I played it for him on the piano and he measured it on his, and then he went around my whole house and he said, you know what? I can't hear it, but if you look at this graph on my machine, that pitch is very present. And then he went around and analyzed, and we found that it was from a transformer about a block away that was somehow louder than most electrical transformers. And it finally solved itself. It either got fixed or it just shifted, or I don't know what happened, but it's not there anymore. But my point to this story is that when I actually had two different experts come, so both experts couldn't hear it, but the one with the $50,000 microphone really helped me. And what it did for me, though, was put me into a tiny bit of a crisis, because I thought, we don't hear the same. We don't all hear the same. So I'm hearing my music a certain way, and I want people to hear what I'm hearing, but I wonder if they do. So, I had to just work that out for myself and just accept, no, they don't have to hear how I hear. I make these pieces to the best of my ability, and people will hear them to the best of theirs, and they will hear it their way. And I really had to work through this feeling of, oh gosh, we're all so different. So I don't know if that helps, but this tightrope of what you know and don't know as you're working. And I also have to say that where I've gotten to in recent years is I just kind of shut everything away and I focus on what I need to do. And this phrase by Agnes Martin really resonates with me. She says, I paint with my back to the world. And so I compose with my back to the world. That is, I try not to worry about likability or about importance. I try to make pieces as though they could all just be tossed in the river after, So I'm really in it for process. The process of creating it is really important, and it's my life. And I love working with musicians, and I love the concert, and I especially love the rehearsals. But I also can let go of that sense of, is it good? That constant judgment, because that just gets in the way. Does that answer any of that?
That makes a lot of sense, and it's really helpful. Yeah, I understand. I was just sort of throwing all this stuff out.
Yeah, no, it's great.
But you're talking about all these tensions. It's almost like a network of tensions, and the metaphor of the tightrope is brilliant, because it's nice to hear that you're aware of the actual tension quality that is inherent about what you're talking about, and that you have had to address it and work through it. And I think it's really, it's very useful for people to know that's part of your creative life. Yeah.
And the tightrope also holds for the musicians who play this kind of music, because it takes a lot of, when you're playing kind of slow and quiet music that's quite exposed, that is a tightrope for musicians, and there's nowhere to hide, and you just have to have such faith and courage in your own abilities to walk out on stage and invite people into that. It is a tightrope for the performer.
Sure. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions from YouTube, and then we're going to open it up to the folks here on Zoom.
Great.
So let me just start with a question here. Do you take specific steps to keep the critical mind out of the generative process? If so, what do you do? You've spoken a little bit to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what helps is to, if you feel that, at least for me, if I feel that I'm getting too judgmental, I invite that part of myself outside of the room. So in the process of creating, it's not helpful to be super critical. You have to be free of that. So it's kind of like flicking those voices off your shoulder and shutting them outside, so that you can just be in the state of play and creativity and confidence of that without voices criticizing all the time. You can invite them back in when you sit back and reflect. But in the moment, you need to get rid of judgment. It's just not, it's not useful, at least for me. That's how I feel.
Great. Here's another one. Thank you, Linda. How do you think of space as material in your compositions, the collective sound space, your personal sound space? In what way have our daily sound spaces become part of your process, part of your pieces? I'm sorry.
That's really, that's a huge thought to think about. First of all, of course, I'm always aware that the concert will be in a space, but I often don't have any control over that. So I've been in situations where I've rehearsed with a group in the most marvelous space you could imagine, and the piece sounded like $1 million. And then the concert is in a box that doesn't sound like anything. So, I often don't have control, but I think you're thinking maybe of another kind of maybe metaphorical space, or maybe one could think of that. And maybe it goes to the idea of trying to make time larger than it is, so that I try to also think that there's room for thought. So maybe there's a kind of space in terms of how things move or change in the piece, or at least in some pieces. I also think of space orchestrationally in a certain way. So I feel that some instruments feel very present to me and some feel more remote to me. And one can think about space in terms of register too. So when that piano piece started very high, it's a thinner kind of atmosphere. It's a very kind of localized high register. But when the piano makes some low notes, which are actually just mid-range, it suddenly opens up a dimension and we have a larger space, and the piano becomes a larger instrument all of a sudden. So this use of register is really like you find it, when you walk out into the water and suddenly there's no ground under you, there's like a deep part suddenly. So we can have this dimension of sudden depth or sudden heights that the piece didn't have before. And in terms of environments, I'm a city girl. I grew up in the city and I always lived in the city, but I'm very, very connected to my experiences of nature. So I'm aware of air and the movement of air and the movement of the trees. This kind of idea of breathing space, is very important. I don't know if that goes to that question or not, but
I think
what comes to mind?
I think it went perfectly to that question. Thank you so much. Why don't we open up the Zoom video boxes for the folks that are here with us on Zoom. And if anyone has a question, I would just invite them to speak up and we will do it that way until it becomes a problem, and it won't become a problem. Corey.
Hello. I do have a question. A lot of what you're talking about, I think, falls under the umbrella of discussing the nature of creation and that process. Um, and something that I always think about with my own work and listening to composers is questions about where that process ends with a piece, but then what comes after. A little bit more specifically, it's a question of like, how permanent is your ink in terms of in composition? Like, how often do you go back? How often do you revise in the process? But also down the road, do you revise your work years later, or when the piece is finished or performed or recorded, does it become its own sort of text? If you could talk about that.
Yeah, that's good. I don't revise a lot. If there's a grievous thing that just doesn't work, I will revise. Usually in the rehearsal situation, I will make it work better. There are a few pieces that I would like to go back to because I feel some unfinished thinking there. But in general, I don't. And the reason I don't is I like to stay current with myself. I like to stay with where I'm at now. And I respect where I was then. And those pieces are the way they are. And I don't actually believe in perfection. So I'm not concerned with fixing something. I'm allowing them to be the way they are with all their flaws, because I think all my pieces are flawed. I think of them as all of them as beautiful failures, and I'm not concerned with making some kind of perfect finished product. I mean, it's great to have a chance to make a recording, but even a recording, I regard as a snapshot of where that performer or those performers were then with how they play the work. And so it's a fluid thing. And, the pieces are in flux, and they exist in the memory, and they exist in recordings of various kinds and in various interpretations. And interpretation is really the art form that the performer is engaged in. And I really love that part of the art form. I'm really interested in it. So I don't revise very much. I have maybe gone, I think there's one piece that I tried to revise and I just couldn't, because it's not where I'm at. It's not that I think it's a bad thing, just not what I do.
Thank you. Anyone else here on Zoom would like to ask a question?
I have a question.
Please.
Linda, I just want to start off by saying, like, I really appreciate like hearing about your process and your vision, and just there's such like a clarity to it that I really admire. And I want to hear about like what your journey has been like in like getting to that point, like as an artist. Because that's something like I still find myself trying to figure out how to articulate some of those things.
Do you mean how I got to the point of what exactly?
Yeah, like being able to like articulate like your artistic vision and like your process and how you compose and like the things that you're aiming for in your music.
I think teaching helps a lot. I mean, I don't talk about my music in school. I never brought my music into lessons or anything like that, but I have had to give talks, both pre-concert talks. I've had to give lectures in other universities many times. And so that's forced me to kind of sit down and look at it. And I also find that I need to sit and wrestle with language. So it really helps me to write, because I don't often know what I think until I either start talking or start writing. And then it starts to come loose in my brain. So I think that part of the process has been sitting around with like-minded colleagues and just bashing out what the heck we're doing and using language to help each other figure that out. And the other side of it is I read a lot of visual artists especially, but also writers about their process. I'm really interested to read how visual artists think. And I also have known, I've been close with some painters. And boy, if you don't know a painter, you should get to know one, because you learn so much about work from talking to a painter. So all of those things, I think, really helped me. And you know, I'm kind of a verbal person. I love language too, but I think it really helps to sit with others and kind of talk things out and find the language that you feel closest gets to the way you're thinking. And even while you're working on a piece, just to take the time to write down some stuff to yourself, because you will find you're discovering what you really think as you do that. That's kind of all I did.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yes, thank
You know, I'll just say we used to have, this is really something that helped me a lot in my earlier years. When I first came to Toronto, another composer and I, John Oswald and I, started a monthly meeting of composers called Composers Conversing. And it was back before email. So I would just phone all the composers I knew and invite them to my place. And we would sit around and play recordings for each other and give feedback to each other. And it would be a long evening with, you know, sometimes some whiskey involved or whatever. And sometimes people would bring works in progress. And this was just like us kind of talking to each other about work. And that was really, really interesting. And we did it for about 2 years until I got tired of hosting it. Nobody else picked it up, so it kind of fell by the wayside. But it was really, really interesting. So that's another idea for that.
it's sort of like bringing back the salon of sorts.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably where we got the idea.
Yeah, great. I'm Peggy.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Linda. That was a wonderful presentation, and this whole conference has just it's been so great to have this bonding between composers and performers, and I've had such a wonderful time working on your piece, and I thank you for that. It's sort of it's given me the courage to revisit this place of patience. And that's a beautiful thing, and I guess it's something we all need a lot of right now. So somehow it was very timely. So I have two questions, one sort of practical and one sort of whatever the opposite of that would be. But you spoke of some of your pieces like endless variations, and I wonder if you have a sense of everything you do and everything you write as like one giant endless variation of you or your life. And then the practical question, as I was listening to the string quartet, it occurred to me, you know, we all know it's really hard to play together, but it's maybe even harder to play intentionally not together. And I wondered how involved you were in their rehearsal process, or if they shared anything. It just struck me as that must have been incredibly difficult to be ever so slightly off. I don't know if it was pulse oriented in the score, but I'm curious about that.
It's very clearly notated. I mean, it's exactly notated. So they had to micro rehearse that, but it's right. You know, string quartets are amazing at knowing where the pulse is and helping each other. So they were always staggered and slightly off, and they just, you know, it's rehearsal. Yeah, it was hard. I had to really, you know, I had to weave it myself first. I had to figure it out. So it's not a question of me asking. I think it would be much harder if I just said, could you not be together? Like,
Yeah.
that's
That's
so counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
They all their life trying to do it. Whereas I wanted it to be untogether, but in a very precise way. So this is where I think notation is our greatest gift, is that we can be somewhat precise and get an imprecise sounding result.
Right.
Like if you want something to sound free, the best thing you can do is notate it, because asking a performer just to be free is just unfair. And as far as the endless variations go, that's just such a new thought you put in my brain. I don't know, but I suppose for every composer, their whole stream of work is really their life's variation and their growth over time. And so, yeah, I don't even know if my works resemble each other from one to the other in some way, but I think they do, because I sometimes hear people say, oh, that's like a Linda Smith piece. So there's something that is like a Linda Smith piece that that must be out there somewhere.
Yeah, I was wondering if we heard a piece from, a different time, would we recognize that? So it's sparking my curiosity to listen to a lot more of your music.
We'll do that next year. I'll bring in something really old.
That would be great. Thank you.
Why don't we take another question from Zoom before I ask a question from YouTube?
I'm curious, of the performers that you've worked with and who have played your music, are there any common threads between their experience of performing your music?
How do you mean common threads?
Like, how do they experience playing your music?
Well, I guess you'd kind of have to ask them, but I do have some performers that I've worked with a lot. And, when I work with, what I like to do is to be in conversation with them. So my pieces are notated in a standard way, and there's a fair bit of detail, but they're not overwhelmingly detailed. So there's also some room for the player. And I think for them, it's once they have an idea of where it sits in terms of things like, what does piano mean, or pianissimo? Like, how quiet is it? And where does it sit in terms of what kind of rhythmic nature is it? Is it rhythmic, or is it actually floating? And once I get those kinds of things across, it seems that performers kind of embrace that and are able to make it their own. But I don't know how to answer what their experience is, except maybe you're resonating with the aspect of tightrope that I spoke about. And that for, it takes a certain kind of poise to go out and play, a very exposed long note with no vibrato, and, just to be not shaking, like any performer, they work their lives to have that kind of skill. But nevertheless, a lot of pieces don't require that. So they have to get in a certain mindset to be willing to be a little bit vulnerable and yet in control. So that dance of vulnerability and control, like, I don't want them to be out of control. I'm not asking for them to take those kinds of risks, but I'm aware that I'm asking them to take a little bit of a journey, even though the music is somewhat simple or appears simple. It takes kind of a certain willingness to make it your own, I guess. And performers that do like it tend to come back to me, and performers that don't like it, well, it's not their thing, and that's okay. Yeah.
It seems almost as if when when a performer approaches your piece, they sort of have to learn the environment that you have set up for your piece and become I guess, sort of acclimated or in tune with that environment so that they can trust that it is going to be the place from which they can make the music that you've written.
I think
Sometimes
that's
I just
true.
think about that long note, the idea that you talk about that long note without vibrato, because for you, a long note without vibrato is, we're not talking like, 3 or 4 seconds. We're talking much longer than 3 or 4 seconds, and at the top of the piece, so that there's a type of trust that this is part of the space, the environment that the piece lives in.
Well, I think it's true for any new piece that the performers have to figure out the environment and the state of mind that piece is. They have to try to understand its world. What new world is this? But so I do think that we don't have absolutes in terms of what do dynamics mean. These things are not cut in stone. It's there's a lot of gradations there. So that's why the communication is important, and why I also try to put in sometimes some words in the score that can feed the imagination a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I've talked about that with some of the fellows this year about, if you put in some notes, like if you say fragile as opposed to saying singing, these affect the touch that anybody's going to bring to it, because performers, they are working with their imagination into their touch, what I call touch anyway, their way they play. And so they really respond to any kind of invitation, because all pieces look like notes on the page, or many of them do, and yet they're all asking to be approached differently. So we as composers can really help with language.
Sure, thank you. Here's a question from YouTube. You've described your relationships with the Bozzini and Penderecki string quartets. I'm curious about your working methods with these performers and perhaps others when working speculatively. Could you talk about this a bit? How much or how closely do these collaborators join you on your speculative journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. And they I've been really lucky with a lot of the performers I've worked with. They join in it fully. And so when usually they first contact me with questions that are practical questions on the score. But in rehearsal, especially, we're both approaching the piece like we're trying to understand it. I'm not there to say, oh, it must be like this. This is how it is. It's more like I was thinking this, or this is the image I had. And then they try to get close to that. It's like, or they will also sometimes say, what do you think about this? And they'll pose something to me that I might not have considered, which is often wonderful and very appropriate. So this conversation is actually speculative on both our parts, where we're both trying to understand it in terms of how their interpretation should manifest. And that's the gold for me, is those conversations, either with, if it's a large ensemble, with the conductor, or even with the solos, just how to get closer to something and to see how they're feeling it and what they want to do. I'm quite flexible to a point. I want all the notes to be there, and I'm interested usually in a certain direction of expressivity. I mean, usually the thing I don't want is too much obviousness. I don't need things shouted, but I am open to how somebody might, say, phrase something, or how much time they might take over something, because they're in the moment. They're doing it in the moment. And I think that's the beauty of it.
Thank you. Yeah, and what you just said almost makes me think about the understanding of what you are making is understanding together. So it's you and the performers are coming to this understanding together. It's still a process of excavating and discovery.
And then the audience is part of that, because then the audience brings their listening to it, and they often will want to come and talk to you after, and they have something to say about the experience usually. And And that thing that they say is usually something that I have not even thought about.
Right.
So it's an image that feeds my understanding of what it might be.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's do one more question from YouTube and then go back to the Zoom folks. I felt a strong kinship in your description of process. Could you talk some about how you view the role of melody or melodic material in your music?
I guess it's somewhat evident that I love melody. Yeah, I feel like melody is a way to live through the harmony. And I love harmony very much. I'm talking about new harmony here, but even old harmony too. And I just really like the way melody can be mysterious. I like the way it can give the piece its movement, so it can generate the feeling of how something moves in time. So it can be this kind of floating, undulating, snaky kind of thing. And I like the way that melody can surprise. It can, so for me, melody is not necessarily dramatic. I prefer melodies kind of like Gregorian chant, where they're just very small melodic motion, but it's a journey, and that little melodic journey just endlessly fascinates me. I can write really long melodies, and I just like to live them out. It's a way of living through sound, I think.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from the folks here on Zoom? We have a few minutes left. Anybody else? Okay, then. Well, in that case, I want to thank you so much for being here and being here this summer with us, Linda, and looking forward to next summer. And thank you for sharing so generously about the inner workings of your creativity. I'm really grateful for that. And
Yeah, thank you.
I think we're all grateful that you were just so honest and open about it all.
Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. I so appreciate it.
Some reminders about upcoming conference events. This evening is a concert of Davidovsky's Synchronisms performed by our ensemble members. Eric Chaslow has created a pre-concert talk using interviews with Mario about his works, and this begins around 5:40 tonight. It'll be here on this YouTube channel. You can also go to composersconference.org and look at the events page, and also on our events page on Facebook. After the pre-concert talk, there'll be the actual performance of a number of the synchronisms at 6 o'clock by the members of the conference ensemble. Tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, we have Meet the Fromm Foundation Composer Fellows, and I'll be moderating that, so please join us. I'll be taking questions from YouTube. And on Friday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, our other guest composer, Amadeus Ugasera, is going to be presenting his work, and I invite you to tune in and hear what he has to say about his creative life. And that evening on Friday, the August 7th at 6 o'clock, we'll have Meet the Contemporary Performance Institute instrumentalists. So that'll be another opportunity to meet the people who are going to be playing the new works by the Fromm composers. And speaking of playing new works by the Fromm composers, on the evenings of August 8th and 9th, that's Saturday and Sunday at 6 o'clock, we'll be having two concerts. These are our gala events, and there will be 5 new works on each of the concerts. These 5 new works were written by our Fromm Foundation Fellows this year and performed by our CPI instrumentalists. It's going to be an amazing event. And as if that were not enough, Peggy Kempmeyer is also going to be playing piano works by Linda and Amadeus, one on each of these concerts. So please join us. If you have any questions, please be in touch with us. Otherwise, thank you all for being here and have a fantastic afternoon.